Welcome to the Paul Street Journal, a production of St. Paul Inside the Walls. The Paul Street Journal is a show all about Catholic economics. From discussing the economic principles laid out in Scripture to answering the economic questions that come up in our daily lives, this show will be your guide to making your own economic decisions with the heart of the Church. I'm Freddy Garcia, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brian Honsberger. Welcome to episode 4 of season 2 of the Paul Street Journal. It's been 70 years since episode 1, at least as far as documents go, but it's only been a couple weeks for us. We have gotten to an encyclical from Pope John XIII titled Mater et Magistra, which means mother and teacher, and it is published on an anniversary of Rerum Novarum, 70th anniversary, and touching on the social question that Pope Leo touched on, then Pope Pius XI touched on, and then Pope Pius XII briefly touched on in a radio address. But like we said last episode where we covered the radio address, that radio address is touched upon by John XXIII, so we felt like we needed to give that some attention too. So we're at the 70th anniversary, which is 1961, May 15th of that year. And before we get into the document itself, let's talk about John XXIII. Who is he, and why did he write this? And why was he the right person to write this? Brian, take it away.
So John XXIII was one of 13 children.
Nice.
And he grew up on a farm. So I think we're going to see in this document that he has a desire to talk a lot about agriculture, and there's no surprise because that's where he comes from. So his parents, they worked a property that they did not own. So they were farmers, but rented the property and created produce for themselves, and they probably sold what they didn't use for themselves. So they were sharecroppers. They didn't own the land, but they worked the land. So they worked on cattle. They had a vineyard. So they're harvesting grapes, probably for wine. So he eventually becomes a priest, and he studies canon law. That's his degree. And
only one?
Just one.
Wow, what a loser.
Huge disappointment. And I think he was a Franciscan. So during World War I, he was in the Italian army and was a medic and a chaplain. So he was one of those guys who was, he was a sergeant, and he was taking people off of the battlefield, caring for them, even doing the sacraments, things like that as a chaplain. So he eventually became a papal and apostolic nuncio in France and was stationed in Bulgaria during World War II. So the story of the way that Jewish people were treated in World War II in Germany and Poland is well known. But there's another story of the Holocaust in the East. So during World War II in Bulgaria and Russia and in what ended up becoming the Eastern Bloc, there was terrible treatment of Jews, and there was a Holocaust of the East as well. John XXIII was a great helper to Jewish people during World War II. So eventually he becomes a cardinal and the Patriarch of Venice, Venice being a very interesting place to be in charge because it's that gateway to the East. So he definitely had this understanding of the relationship between the West and the East, and especially during the globalization of World War I and II, he was in a unique position for the 20th century. So in 1958, Pope Pius XII passes away.
Okay.
And John XXIII, he watches the funeral on TV, I believe,
Wow.
and he has to get on a train to go to Rome as a cardinal to elect the next pope. Mm-hmm. He buys a two-way ticket. To the surprise of many, he's made pope at the age of 76.
Wow.
And that's very old, especially for back then.
Mm-hmm. He
So
lost his ticket back.
he did not use the ticket to get back to Venice. And because of how old he was, the idea here, I think, from the papal conclave was that he wouldn't be pope for long and that he wouldn't do very much. But he did name a number of cardinals from Africa, Japan, and the Philippines. So he continues this global leadership initiative that was started by previous popes that we've talked about.
Yeah.
And then lastly, and perhaps most significantly, he called for the Second Vatican Council.
That's right.
So He did not live to see that council finish, but he called it, and he called it by radio address, I believe, if I remember correctly. And it's important to know that by calling the Second Vatican Council, he wasn't starting a new council in many ways. It was a continuation of Vatican I, which never really finished. Mm-hmm. Vatican I was underway in the late 1800s, and because of a war, they had to cut it off. So they never really finished it. They had some big unanswered questions from Vatican I, left unanswered. So Vatican II, in many ways, is just continuing that.
Yeah, okay, I see. Yeah, and those details are super important. I mean, Vatican II kind of echoes into today. It's the last ecumenical council we've had, right?
Oh, yeah.
So okay, John the 23rd did a lot. And he was Pope in a pretty turbulent time, or was rising to the papacy in a turbulent time with the wars in his lifetime, and then finally becoming Pope to call Vatican II, which he didn't get to see finish, but important nonetheless. So now let's talk a little bit about when this document comes out. It's not too long before Vatican II, 1961, at least before he calls it, but it is before, and it's after those wars. So tell us a little bit about where we are in the landscape for this document.
Mm-hmm. So World War II is over. Pope John the 23rd argues that in the developed nations, capitalism has destroyed itself. So that free market environment is gone and it's been replaced by something else. But he says that capitalism in its youngest phase is just starting in many developing countries, and that these countries have the opportunity to soften the harshness of capitalism before it gets as bad as it got in what is now, in 1961, the industrial nations. So I think that's interesting. He says that technology has reached a level that the world has not seen, and it's changing the economic and moral environment entirely. So we have nuclear energy, which has not been addressed really in any of the encyclicals that we've talked about. The power to destroy a city or power a city for good. Television, space exploration, synthetic materials like plastics, biological manipulation. The first in vitro fertilization happened in 1959 with an animal, and there's already talk of doing so with human beings. So major tech innovations.
Yeah, I think that's been a trend in this season, that each pope technology has just started booming, and because of that, there's been big moral implications to those questions. So each pope has had to address more things. The last pope we covered made his address through the radio. So, and that's probably going to continue. Like as these years go on, for the next encyclicals that we'll cover, there's going to be more technology. I think John makes it clear that that's the case, that technology is still on the rise, and he feels the need to continue addressing the new things that have come out.
Yeah. And the calls of how to use tech and how to associate with tech, the principle, there seems to be a principle that's emerging among the popes, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Okay.
But he observes, Pope John, that technology is seen by many people as an end, not as a means, as an end to help people or help the environment, but as an end in itself. Like the goal of humanity is technological innovation and progress. And he says, that's not necessarily sensible.
Yeah.
And in many ways, it's idolatry. So scientists and engineers are almost like looking at the works of their hands as an idol, as an object of worship, like the golden calf made of silver or gold.
Right. Yeah, I think he uses the term like there's a lure of the novelty. There's just this desire to keep advancing more novelty, more new things, better tech. And it becomes, even though these people probably don't realize it, quite an idol. But he addresses it. So
yeah. There's a major focus of John the 23rd on social progress. So he seems to be much more optimistic about how things are going in the developed nations. He praises the wider access to education, the wider access to opportunity and improving your social standing. He praises insurance and Social Security. So early on in an episode, I said that the primary reasons for civilization are beer, insurance, and indoor plumbing. And I'm just making this up, of course, but it doesn't come from nowhere.
Yeah.
And here we see the praise of insurance. And I know most people think that insurance is boring and it's just an expense. But just think about how much less people suffer from like the risk of loss as a result of things like Social Security and health insurance and things like that.
Yeah.
So it's improving people's lives, and they're able to look to the future with safety and confidence in a way that humans haven't been able to in the past.
Yeah, I think he makes the point that it kind of replaced, or not replaced, but it's that safety net that property was for the people that had a property.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was either Leo or Pius that used similar language like that it's a human's form of sustenance for a long period of time. And that those that didn't have it, insurance kind of became that. And it's a good thing that he's praising, you know, like beer and indoor plumbing. It's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
So yes.
Yeah. And another economic observation that he makes is that there has been continued and increased departure from rural life, people leaving farms, agriculture, moving to the cities. Mm-hmm. And he observes in a negative way that the governments are in some ways doing good things, education, hospitals, amenities, they're collecting taxes and they're giving these things to the public. Good. But bad is that those government services tend to be in urban areas. So the rural folk are not getting equal treatment. And that's part of the reason why people are leaving rural areas. It's hurting agriculture. It's creating disparity between urban and rural. Urban becomes suddenly wealthy while rural suddenly becomes poor. Mm-hmm. And the farmers have a lower standard of living. That's something he's very concerned about. And don't forget his background.
Yeah, he was a farmer,
mm-hmm.
right? Hey everyone, it's me. Sorry for interrupting the show. I'm sure I probably interrupted Brian talking, so it's okay. But I just want to jump in to say that if you're liking the Paul Street Journal and you want to see more content like it, please do like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications so that you're notified when we have any new releases. And also, if you have any questions or comments, please do leave them in the comment section and we'll try our very best to respond to them later on in the episodes. Also, make sure to check out the other shows that are produced by the diocese. Those shows are Beyond the Beacon with Bishop Kevin Sweeney, which you can find on Bishop Kevin Sweeney's YouTube channel, and Coffee with Cupkey with Father Paul Manning and Monsignor Raymond Cupkey, which you can find right here on the St. Paul Inside the Walls YouTube channel. With all that said, thank you. Let's get back to the show. Okay, what's next?
Another thing Pope John XXIII is concerned with, especially in regards to workers, is that people are just too busy. People are working really hard at work. They're trying hard to become proficient in their job. They don't seem to be relaxing well, taking care of their family well, resting well, worshiping well. And he is calling for people to rest more and for employers to allow that. Mm-hmm. And he's recognizing that this economy requires specialization. And that specialization requires rather intense, rather specific training. And people need time for that.
Yeah.
So he's asking employers to just allow people to have more time to do these things.
Right.
He is saying that wealthy countries are starting to help poor countries by this time. And he praises that. He says it's great. But he is observing that some of that has become like a neo-colonialism, where it's like a quid pro quo, and a wealthy country will give a whole bunch of money or resources to a developing or a not so wealthy country, but then ask the recipient country to do some morally questionable things, mm-hmm. or to do something that would be against the uniqueness of their society.
Yeah. I think they're maybe in a way helping for their own benefit to have, political control and be able to exercise more authority, worldwide authority, which he kind mm-hmm. of doesn't like.
Right. So, and, we'll talk more about that. That's just part of the landscape of what's happening right now. And then the last thing I want to mention about the landscape of this era is that there's a world population increase and there's a major concern for the overpopulation of the world, expending the world's resources, and ruining the environment, and even too many humans being bad for humanity.
Yeah.
Even.
Yeah. So I think that's generally the landscape, and a lot of it was covered by John himself in the document.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the document itself, which we'll get into now, I think we both agree that he kind of splits it up into thirds. The first third is him praising the previous documents, his predecessors, reaffirming a lot of things. He doesn't use language as, he doesn't call Leo's document immortal, but he does praise it a lot. So that's the first third. And then the second third is, I think, where he goes through this landscape quite a bit, and then also kind of develops what the problem is, or asserts what the problem is, or how the problem has evolved, and why he needs to write this document in the first place, basically. And then the third part, I think, is where he gets into his solution, in a way, his suggestions, his development of doctrine, and his adjustments to the things his predecessors promulgated.
And there's some big developments here.
Absolutely, yeah.
Can't wait to get into them.
Yeah, so now we can, I think, essentially get into more clearly what the problem is. So the landscape, like we've said, World War II is over. He's happy with some things, not so happy with others. I think, in short, if I were to describe the problem, or a big picture problem that's kind of causing all the other rifts and problems, and I think this is what John would say, Pope John, I think that because of that attention to technological development, attention, time, money, everything that's effort that's getting thrown at that, there's been a lot of imbalances, like you previously mentioned. There's an imbalance that, because so much effort, time, and attention is given to that, to technological development, there's things that aren't receiving enough attention. And those things are what are causing this new moral problem. So I think, in short, the big things he talks about is that before, with Leo and Pius, the 11th and the 12th, there was this concern between the worker and the employer. That was the main concern.
Capital and labor.
Capital and labor.
Right.
And that starts with Leo, and it's very clear what his suggestions are, and we went through them in episode 1. And then, as technology keeps developing, the problem kind of increases, and it becomes, I think it was Pius XI who talked about managers and directors and investors, and then the problem keeps increasing. And I think now, to John the 23rd, he talks about not only the imbalance between capital and labor, but he talks about different sectors of the economy. It's becoming a lot more macro in John's time. So he talks about the imbalances between sectors of the economy within the same nation, within the same political order. And then another big problem is the imbalance, like you mentioned, between nations. Some nations are growing technologically, economically at rapid rates, while others are not, essentially. And I think that's the problem. And I think that's the big picture problem that has many smaller problems in it. And he addresses that, I think, in a very big document. And it kind of looks like a self-help book. There's like title, this is what it is. Title, this is what it is. So it's a great document to read, I think, because if you want to know what the issue that he's addressing is, you can maybe Command F. What does he say about this? And then it takes you to the section. So it is pretty good. But we'll try to cover as much as we can, as quickly as we can, pretty much.
Yeah. I like your introduction. It's almost as if disparity is still present in 1961, but it's a different kind of disparity than there was in 1891. The principles laid out by Leo are the same, but it's kind of a new environment.
Absolutely.
And one that we highlighted already is that disparity between urban and rural, right? But we're going to start with labor and private property. And in paragraphs 108 and 109, we get this idea from John that work is more dignified and personal than private possessions, which is an interesting way of thinking about the relationship between private property and labor, isn't it?
Yeah, I think he suggested it kind of got there. Society got there. He's like, there's this new advancement, this new view on work that people value more their income from their skill than they do the possession that they would earn. And I when I read that, I was like, oh, he's going to say that's a bad thing. But then he basically says, this is the right view. And in my mind, I was like, what? Oh, no. But then he develops it, and he basically says that, which you just said.
Yeah,
the work is dignified and personal.
Yeah, and in no way is he discounting private property. After he praises this movement towards the praise of labor, he then spends all kinds of time on the good and the naturalness and the need for private property. But he has this wonderful, it's a theological observation. And he's saying, when you are working and making things with your hands or with your mind, when you're taking part in a creative process to build something, to make something, you're imitating God, right? God being the creator. When you work, you're imitating God in many ways in the creative and in the creative process.
Yeah, I think he also uses language like participating in the work, especially of Christ, who became incarnate and worked. So I think he uses kind of language to show that our work itself, for itself, not just because of the property that it gets, but the dignity of this work is a participation, perhaps, in the work of Christ. And that is, a wonderful theological observation, like you said. And I think a development in a way.
It's a development. It's an adjustment, because in times past, I think there would have been skepticism for proletarianism. And this is, I think, an acceptance that selling your labor for wages is, maybe it's not so bad, especially in a very particular context. So we're going to talk a little bit about private property, because that's what John does. But then we're going to talk about, he's going to get really strong about the types of working relationships, the relationship between owner and employer and an employee, and how employees should become either partners or owners. So we'll get into that. But he says that the work and the labor might be more important than the property. And then he says how important private property is.
Right.
And he kind of doubles down on what previous popes have said about private property, calling for governments to have economic and political policies in place to ensure that as many people in the population as possible have private property, even if that requires distribution of property.
Right.
Now, that's not the distribution of wealth, right? It's just giving somebody a home base so that they can produce their own wealth.
Yeah, I think in very clear ways, calling back to the distributism that arose as a principle in the previous documents. And what I like, and I think I would like to point out at this stage, because I think Pope John does it throughout, is that he really emphasizes that these things in theory are not enough. Talking about the principles in themselves is not enough. We have to pursue them. We have to find out how to practically live out these principles. So I think for this distributism, we said before that maybe in short, distributism can be defined as many people as possible should become owners, and the law should favor ownership. And I think John, in a way, says all the effort that was given or that has been given to technological development, give that effort to this need, to attaining this principle and living by it. And we'll see that he calls upon many different people to do that, the state, workers, employers, and all the things. And I just wanted to point that out because I think that that's his advice for all the issues that he does cover. It's like, principle is not enough. It is the foundation, but we need to actualize it. We need to pursue it. Let's put effort into pursuing it. So I just wanted to make that note.
Yeah, I think that you're reading correctly. He emphasizes that throughout. All right, so he adds that nations and governments should be focusing on making sure that the largest percentage possible of the population is employed.
Yeah, almost like a distributist view of labor.
I think so.
Like, as many people that can work should work. As many people as can own should own.
Yeah, and that's one of the two primary functions of the Federal Reserve today, is to make moves so that they're maximizing employment.
Right.
All right. Another thing that John wants to focus on is employers ensuring that laborers have the time to worship, to rest, and to become more proficient, to be better trained for their very specialist type of job.
Yeah, like you said before, that the wider access to education and opportunity has kind of created this economy and society where more time and attention is given to that, to training, like schooling, perhaps in a different way. We talked about the guild system before, masters and journeymen, and how there's this development of a skill, of a craft. And I think he's basically pointing out that it's evolved to a very different place now, where we have universities and training and specialization, but like almost like a good development, a healthy development, if looked at correctly, I think.
Yeah, in the right context, I think he would praise this idea of spending more time to like even go to college to pursue a more specialized type of career. I do think that there's some problems with seeing the university system as job training and expecting that it becomes more of a financial transaction than actually learning or learning how to learn. So it could be a misappropriation of the university system to see it as a means to getting a job or a career.
Yeah.
The university system was never established for that. The guild system was job training. And it was very kinesthetic, like on the job, learning from somebody who was doing it while they were doing it. And oftentimes, but not always, it was free. So you would be working and learning at the same time, and you weren't paying to learn necessarily, even though that did happen sometimes. And people certainly weren't going into like $250,000 in debt in the guild system to get job training.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think we're in an interesting moment in human history where the guild system is gone, and the only means for obtaining a lucrative career is through the university system, and the world is wrestling out a new way, trying to fabricate a new way into like this market economy with a proletarian mindset. You know?
Yeah, and I appreciate your point. I think I see what you're saying. That I think topic would be a cool episode to.
That's a season 3 episode right there.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, please let's continue.
Okay. So in regards to labor, Pope John really encourages workers to enter into partnerships more so than employer-employee contracts, where one person is charged and the other person is subservient. He really likes the idea of partnerships. So he's strong about this. And for those who aren't in the partnership contract, he wants employees to receive a share in the ownership of the company. Not just a share in the ownership, but also a say in the direction of the company. All right. This might sound obvious and simple, and people who work in a white-collar job today probably get stock options and things like that. But just think about like a fast food worker, and think about them in addition to getting their wage, getting like shares of the company, and even a say in the direction of the company. I mean, it sounds unrealistic, but that's because these companies are not fulfilling the Catholic social teaching that John is calling for here.
Right, yeah, and it's like that kind of compensation or participation and ownership of a company sounds like it makes those kinds of jobs so much more attractive. Like it's an entry level job in which you're actually getting set up for more. You know, you're not the kind of proletarian that Leo was complaining so much about, that they have nothing but the minimum wage, and that's what's keeping them going. But that is someone that has, perhaps, they're still a proletarian, they're still working for a wage, but now they're like building ownership. And that would be an awesome thing to see, but it's not something we do see very much.
Not in certain types of jobs. You know, you see it a lot if you work for like a giant pharmaceutical company. You might get shares, probably not a say in the future direction of the company, but you'll at least get some shares.
Yeah.
All right, so there's 3 types of workers that seem to be neglected by governments in 1961, and others that are favored. And what John the 23rd is calling for is equal treatment among economic sectors. He points out 3 that are, I think, neglected: craftsmen, family farmers, and cooperatives. That is, people coming together to maybe forming a company to make a product, let's say, and they're all, let's say, equal owners in that.
Right.
So all he's calling for here is that there's care and concern and thoughtfulness in government regulation and support, and in safety nets for all these different types of workers. If you think about it today, who has easier access to social safety nets? And who has access to better tax rates? Is it giant corporations, or is it, the small mom and pop shop?
Giant corporations.
I mean, think about health insurance and how hard it is for access to high quality health insurance plans for a small business with less than 50 employees versus a global company, right?
Right. Yeah, I think this is kind of echoing that main point I try to highlight, that there's imbalances. And what he's saying is that there's not enough thoughtfulness and attention given to these, at least to the level that it's given to the industry, to the industrial workers and industrial work. And that's what he's calling for. He's like, let's give some more attention to them, like you've mentioned. So the document is about the social question, kind of. That's what it's been labeled as, I think. And I think he basically, there's continuous progress for the people, for the workers, for the industries, for the sectors of the economy. And I think he wants a balanced progress. And there's a paragraph later that will kind of say it in his words. But I think that there's an imbalance for these workers. And that's, long story short, what they aren't getting.
Yeah. Another big topic that John focuses on is the responsibility of governments in regards to technology. So some of the technologies are getting so big and so powerful that Pope John believes it actually becomes the responsibility of the government to act sometimes sooner than usual and more so. If you think about the potential of nuclear energy to help or destroy. In today's time, we think about the potential of artificial intelligence, right? Sometimes getting ahead of these things is really important for the government before it gets out of control and before these technologies get too big or even too powerful. I think about what happened with credit default swap and derivatives and what that did to the economy in 2008. So the government wasn't on top of this, and then there was no regulation. It just got out of control. I was in my office in finance when Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers was going under, and we were all looking at ourselves and saying, how could this have happened so fast? Yesterday it was fine, and today these companies are gone, right? It's just because the government didn't have any understanding or control of what was happening until it was too late.
Yeah, I think that's kind of has been highlighted by previous popes and their documents, that the government has this responsibility for these big picture issues in the economy. And I think this almost feels like a reaffirmation of that the government really does have a role in this developing process, essentially. I think 2008 is an example of that not happening.
That's right. I think we could move on to agriculture now, which is a focus of this document. So he argues that farming should be just as attractive as city life. Is that how people think today?
I don't think so.
He thinks that government services should be just as accessible or as accessible as possible for rural people as for urban people. That includes schools, hospitals, parks, amenities, things like that. He says that there's going to be times where there's a need for low food prices so that the poor can eat, but that low food prices should not turn into low wages for farmers. The food economy begins with the farmer, and they need to be well taken care of to make sure that the whole society could be sustained.
Yeah, I think here he tries to give specific advice of how to help the farmer, how to help different sectors of the economy. And we probably won't go into them, but he talks about things like taxation, credit banks, insurance, and social security. He talks even about price protection.
Yes.
So I think he, maybe because he's very concerned about the farmers and his family, but he gets pretty specific, I think.
He does. What we have to mention here is the banking situation and access to capital and credit for farmers. So hundreds of years ago in papal encyclicals, there was this rule against usury and loans and debt and things like that. And the church did not really follow up on that topic as satisfactorily as I would desire. And it stayed rather silent about it. And it even didn't follow its own advice for like centuries. For example, like a church historically wouldn't be able to be dedicated until it was paid off. But oftentimes, what does that suggest? That it was paid for with loans, which is, technically against prior rules in regards to debt and usury.
Right.
So what is Pope John saying here? Without saying it, he's amending and adjusting the church's stance on debt. And he's saying that there's such thing as good debt. He's saying that farmers should have access to obtaining capital through loans as long as the interest rate is fair. All right, so here's how I live my life. For me, 3% interest rate is almost zero, right? The new economy post-currency and Federal Reserve system, right? The value of the dollar decreases by about 3% a year, give or take. So a 3% loan is essentially free money.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. A good explanation of that, I think. And he really puts responsibility again in the hands of the government for this question. He's like, this should be policy, not just this isn't just a principle about usury. This is true. The farmers are struggling. They might need loans, but there need to be fair loans, essentially. And that is what he says, I think. Yeah. So,
do you want to read paragraph 128 at all, or did you kind of just?
I think I should, because I think it sums up his idea about a balanced development, balanced social progress, and it's relatively short. So, 128. If a country is to develop economically, it must do so gradually, maintaining an even balance between all sectors of the economy. Agriculture, therefore, must be allowed to make use of the same reforms in the method and type of production and in the conduct of the business side of the venture as are permitted or required in the economic system as a whole. All such reforms should correspond as nearly as possible with those introduced in industry and the various services. And for me, that just summed up the whole document, or at least his approach, that so much attention is given to industry and to the services. He says that a country's economy should develop gradually and in a balanced way. Yeah. And he's basically saying all that for me, the attention, the effort, the time that you've given to technological development, please use those methods, he says methods and types for these sectors that are struggling, these countries that are struggling, these people that are struggling. Big picture, that's I think what he's saying. He's like, let's redirect, or let's use what's been working, this obvious technological advancement, and return to these people that are struggling with these principles in mind. Let's pursue virtue, the social and moral progress, as well as this economic and technological progress. And that's what I think paragraph 128 says. So,
yeah, amen. That is a principle that could be applied in any place at any time. It's timeless. And it's still not being practiced today. When you think about the political divisions of the United States, these electoral maps show blue in urban areas and red in rural areas.
Yeah.
And what does that show? What does that show? The real rivalry in the United States right now, and even in New Jersey, is primarily, I would argue, rural versus urban. It's exactly what Pope John is talking about here. And a lot of the people in these rural environments feel like all of the taxes that are taken from them by the government are going towards urban projects and urban areas, and they, in the rural areas, feel neglected, right? Yeah. So, Joe, do you want to show some of these maps from the 2020 presidential election? Now, remember, at the Wall Street Journal, we don't support Democrats or Republicans, but we're trying to make the point here that when you think of New Jersey, you probably think that it's a 100% blue state, right? It's always electing Democrats, but look at that blue line through the center of the state. That's what connects Trenton and New York City. It goes right through New Jersey, so that's a very urban area. And then we get Camden in the south and Newark and Essex County in the north. But all those rural areas where you see farms and ski mountains and oceans, what do you see? You see red. So there's that rivalry, even in New Jersey, between rural and urban.
Yeah.
Now, maybe we could take a look at the United States map. So let's say every box, every district here or town had the same amount of people. You would think that this was a red country. But in reality, it's closer to 50-50, and it's the rural areas that are red and the urban areas, again, especially on the coast, that are blue. And this is just showing, again, at a national scale, the rivalry between urban and rural. And what Pope John is saying is that rivalry, in many ways, has been sparked by governments favoring one over the other. And it seems to be the people in the rural areas who are angry, right? Yeah. Because they feel neglected and left behind. So what John is calling for is solidarity in between both rural and urban, for care to be given equally to both. Yeah. And of course, it's hard in rural environments because people are so spread out. So there's even opportunities with technology to actually help with that.
Right. Yeah. And again, it's this imbalance, I think, that specifically in this time period that John points out, is that the rural areas are getting the smaller side of the stick. So he's saying, and he's calling for the technology to improve it. He's calling for infrastructural improvements. Like he specifically talks about the roads and the bridges and school buildings. I think, again, it's a concern that he's raising for people that are being neglected to some degree in his time, especially by this technological boom that's happening more so in the cities. And like you said, it echoes that perhaps even to today, and feeling of misrepresentation or of under-resourced areas.
Sure. Yeah. All right, let's move on to some global issues that Pope John is talking about. So it's important to make this clear that Pope John, and really no pope, encourages a one-world government. They do encourage global unity and solidarity. All right, so those are not the same thing. Pope John says that every country has something that's unique about it from its very foundation, its culture, and that they should remain unique and really champion those things that make them unique. So just because you're in union with other countries doesn't mean you leave your uniqueness, right? So unity and uniqueness, which is why he's against that neo-colonial understanding of wealthy nations helping poor nations. The goal of the wealthy nation should be to help the poor nation out of a sense of love and kenosis, not out of a desire to make another country like itself. Right. Like, we don't need to take our governmental system and shove it down some other nation's throats, or say, okay, African country, we'll give you several $1 billion, but you have to make sure that birth control is accessible to all the women, right?
Yeah.
That would be neo-colonialism.
Yeah. I think that principle of unity and uniqueness, or unity, not uniformity, maybe to use John's words, is not only helpful in this economic, geopolitical sphere, but also in even liturgically, liturgical expressions, or even I don't know. I think that this is really a beautiful principle generally in Catholic.
So funny you say that.
Understanding, and I think that it's true. Unity, not uniformity. That can be expressed liturgically, economically, politically, maybe.
Yeah, it could be politically. That's really well said. I think American liturgy is very much informed by Irish people. And Irish liturgy is usually very quiet and slow and solemn, and I've said this before, but my wife is from Nigeria, and if you go to their churches and you don't dance, you don't love Jesus, right? Can you just imagine dancing in an Irish, it would never happen, right? So again, just to make the point,
unity, not uniformity.
That's right.
Celebrate the uniqueness. Yeah.
All right, another major global issue, and everybody should remember that this is a papal encyclical that's rather binding on Catholics. John says military buildup for deterrence is not appropriate. So some, especially in the military environment, will say that a stronger military and using a large percentage of GDP to build up the military will create peace by deterring other countries from even trying something tricky. Mm-hmm. And what Pope John is saying is that, well, what does that lead to? It leads to distrust between nations. So one country is building up their military, well, a neighboring country or a rival, economic rival country will have to build up their military. And what that does is it just leads to a lack of trust and to a higher probability of war. Mm-hmm. So he is clear in saying, no, that's not the way to do it. And he says that building up the military for deterrence is a waste of time, energy, and money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think he, at this point of the document, starts saying, okay, we need to figure out what the way forward is. Mm-hmm. These things are bad. Let's shake some sense into ourselves. And I think at this point is when he starts to talk about the Christianization, the need for God so that we can reevaluate and understand why nuclear proliferation is a bad thing. That's not true peace, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this is where he starts to really give his advice and say why it's important to invite God into this understanding of the world.
Yeah, I love that you said that. So he says that first, a country has to believe in God. Mm-hmm. And from that belief, you will get morality. Because morality without God is arbitrary. We're just making things up. Really, it's just whoever's most powerful. Without God, power wins. So we get God, and from God we get morality, a moral code. From the moral code we get order. And from order we get peace. If you take out God, you take out morality, you don't get order, and you get war. Mm-hmm. Right? So this isn't just mechanical or logistical or strategic. It's moral and it's theological.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think all the principles come out of this order, God, morality, to order, and to peace. I think each is fruits of the other. So mm-hmm. our moral code is fruit of obeying God's law and his natural law. And then these principles that we talk about, like solidarity and whatnot, those are fruits of a moral code, fruits of seeking order. I just love that structure, that from God to morality to order to peace. And all these principles that we've been talking about, economic principles, really fit in very perfectly, I think, to that structure.
Yeah. In the year 2024, it's a really hard thing that he's saying. Because let's say there's a country that's atheistic and therefore doesn't have morals and is building up its military. What do you do?
Yeah.
What do you do? So if I were Pope John the 23rd today, trying to understand him as a person, I think he would say, okay, yeah, you're going to need a military just to make sure that this godless country might be aggressive.
Yeah.
But don't let that be the primary focus.
Right.
Like, have your military, be responsible, and protect your citizens, but really let the focus be unity, solidarity, reaching out, forming agreements, however you can.
Yeah, I think that's well said.
Yeah. Okay. He says that we should be caring for the environment. He says that tech is not an end and should always focus on the good of people and the good of nature, right? So tech is not an end. It's a means to an end. The end is goodness, goodness for people, goodness for the planet. Tech should never become an end in of itself. Otherwise, it'll become an enemy, which is becoming more and more true today. He says that births should not be prevented due to concerns about world population. So he has two arguments in this regard. The first is that he has this trust in humanity and humans' innovation capabilities to solve whatever needs are coming up due to a huge world population. He has this trust in man's innovation. And then secondly, he also believes that if there's a lack of anything like food, it's usually not due to too many people, but to selfish people. So fulfilling that call of human solidarity, human dignity, the universal destination of goods, that is the answer to a large global population.
Right. Yeah, I keep repeating this, so it might sound annoying at this point, but I think once again, he's just like, all the effort that's been put that way, technological development, let's redirect that effort to this problem. And I think he says that so frequently, and it's like all throughout the document. And instead of saying, let's control birth, let's reduce, I guess it's built upon this idea that we have, like we've said, God first, morality, then order, then peace. So with your principles set, and you say, no, we have to respect the infinite dignity of human life. He says that quite clearly. So you can't control birth in an artificial way because that's not God's law. That's not God's plan. So with that set in stone, let's find a solution. The way that we found solutions to XYZ in the industrial world, let's find for this social problem. And again, I think he said that every single time, and I've said it every single time, just because I think his point. So much can be solved if these principles are what's guiding us, and if the effort, the really incredible achievements that have been coming up to his time are just sought for in this realm.
Fully agree. One of the most well-known stories of the 1960s is that we were pouring all this money into space exploration, landing on the moon, which is really cool. Really, really cool. But there were so many Americans who felt neglected at the same time. And they felt bad. They felt bad that we had all this money and innovation going towards this moon landing, and there were still people who were being suppressed. Like Jim Crow is still going on, right? So just to make your point perfectly clear.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to finish by saying something that I find it to be humorous, but it's really not funny. Pope John says that this Catholic social teaching on economics and Catholic social doctrine, he says it's mandatory. It's mandatory. And we follow the Catholic Church's teachings on all sorts of things. Right? But for some reason, he's observing in 1961 that Catholic social teaching on economics, it's almost like second doctrine.
Yeah.
So there's the primary doctrine that people care about and vote about. For some reason, people have placed this kind of stuff at a lower level. And he says, no, that doesn't make sense. We have to follow each of these doctrines provided by the Church.
I love the structure that we have here, the God, morality, order, peace. And I think this, in his conclusion, which we're kind of essentially at, is where he says, we need to re-Christianize the culture, and these things will follow. As long as we have God first and the important, let's say, dogmas, and we're like really heeding God's command, these things will follow. But very clearly, I think he's emphasizing that the doctrine on this subject needs to be taught. It needs to be included in that Christianization of the culture.
He says that it needs to be in seminaries, and that no theological or catechetical education is complete without it.
Yeah, and he would probably complain about today, as he did in 1961, that it's not well known. It's still in this secondary category for a lot of people. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the point of this podcast, to really shed light on the beauty of it, the bindingness of it.
I know I have many Catholic acquaintances and friends who love the Church. They follow all the precepts of the Church. They go to Mass. They go to confession. The way that they vote is informed very much by their Catholicity. But they have not heard at all about Catholic social teaching on economics. And as a result, sometimes aren't even representing Catholicism in the way that they vote, in the way that they act in the economy.
Yeah. And I think he's still hopeful. He's hopeful throughout this whole document. So he basically is like, okay, lay apostles, my clergy, all of you, go into the culture. He's like, don't retreat and cling to, these principles that I'm talking about. No, go seek to implant these principles in all sectors of your life, in all sectors of the economy, in all sectors of the culture. And in a sense, he says you don't need to leave the economy to be holy. It's holy to be bringing holiness to the culture and to the world. I love that, and I think that's something to emphasize. It's almost like a duty of evangelization, duty to evangelize is I think what he kind of gets at. And it's I think it summarizes this document. He's like, we're not going to retreat and leave everyone else that's struggling and let them struggle. It's let's reinforce these principles. Let's stand on our firm ground, and let's just redirect all the effort that's gone one way in this economy, pretty secular economy, pretty maybe evil, some evil in many sectors of it. And let's just double down on our principles, double down on these strategies and forms that are working. Let's take the good, get rid of the bad, and Christianize the economy. And that's really his call, I think. And it's developed still. Doesn't end here with Catholic social teaching on economics. But that's, I think, generally the end of Mater Magistra. I think that's what John XXIII had to say. So there's more to come. There's more developments, adjustments, and the landscape has obviously continued to change. So there's hope, I think, in John the 23rd's outlook, and I hope that it bears fruit, and I hope that the next documents will shed even more light on the beauty of what the popes have had to say thus far. So thanks, Brian, for walking through Mater Magistra with me. Thanks, Joe, for production, and thank you all for listening to the Paul Street Journal. See you next time.